Mom texted. Changed all the locks on the doors and gates. We don't trust you. I chuckled. Cool, but you missed one thing. I canceled the $500-600 mortgage payment I'd been covering, even though they decided my sister was more worthy of the house. Their lawyer panicked. We have a problem. Call immediately. I didn't answer because everything was all ready. Ethan stared at his phone screen, reading the message for the third time. His mother, Patricia's words, burned into his retinas like acid. 28 years old, and she still treated him like a rebellious teenager who couldn't be trusted with house keys. The irony tasted bitter in his mouth as he sat in his cramped Portland apartment, surrounded by boxes he'd been too exhausted to unpack after moving out 3 months ago. His fingers trembled slightly as he set the phone down on the kitchen counter, next to a stack of bills that reminded him exactly how much that monthly $5,600 payment had been stretching his budget. The payment he'd been making religiously for 2 years, ever since his father Robert had that health scare and couldn't work. The payment that kept their family home in southeast Portland from being foreclosed. The same house where his sister Bethany now lived rent-free, playing the role of the golden child who'd never left home, never disappointed anyone, never made the wrong choices. The morning sunlight streaming through his apartment window felt different somehow, sharper and more decisive. Ethan pulled up his banking app with the same methodical precision he used when debugging code at his software job. His thumb hovered over the mortgage payment scheduled for tomorrow, $5,600. Every month for 24 months straight, $57,600 of his own money poured into a house where he was apparently no longer welcome. The payment authorization screen glowed back at him, waiting for his decision. Around him, his apartment felt smaller suddenly, cramped with the weight of his family's betrayal. His laptop sat open on the coffee table, work emails blinking unread, but all he could think about was Bethany's smug face when she'd moved back home last year after her divorce. How quickly she'd positioned herself as the devoted daughter, the one who truly cared about family, while painting him as the selfish son who'd moved out to live his own life. Ethan's finger moved across the screen with surprising steadiness. Payment canceled. The words appeared in red text, final and irreversible. His heart hammered against his ribs, but not from fear, from something that felt dangerously close to liberation. He'd spent 2 years sacrificing his own financial security, his own dreams of buying a place, his own future, to keep his family's house. And this was how they repaid him. By changing locks and sending text messages like he was some kind of threat. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Patricia, this one longer, filled with justifications about trust and Bethany's needs and how they'd decided he'd been too unpredictable lately. Too unpredictable. He'd been working 60-hour weeks to afford their mortgage payments while Bethany lounged around the house she now apparently deserved more than he did. His jaw clenched as he read her reasoning, each word a fresh insult. They wanted predictable? He'd show them predictable. The rest of the day passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. Ethan went to work, wrote code, attended meetings, responded to emails, all while feeling like he was watching someone else live his life. His colleagues noticed nothing different about him, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. Every time his phone buzzed, he expected panic from his family, expected the frantic calls when they realized what he'd done, but the day remained quiet. They probably hadn't even noticed yet that the payment hadn't gone through. They'd taken his financial support so for granted that they didn't even track it anymore. That evening, he sat in his apartment eating takeout Chinese food straight from the container, staring at the boxes he still hadn't unpacked. For 2 years, he'd been too busy working extra hours to afford their house payment to properly settle into his own space. Now, for the first time since moving out, he actually wanted to make this place feel like home. The call came at 7:30 the next morning. Ethan was in the middle of his coffee routine, grinding beans with the expensive grinder he'd bought himself for Christmas, when his phone exploded with Robert's ringtone. His father's voice sounded strained, confused, the way it had during those awful months after his health problems. But this wasn't about medical bills anymore. The mortgage company had called. Payment declined. Insufficient funds. Robert's voice cracked as he explained that they'd been counting on that payment, that the house would be in jeopardy without it. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on Ethan. They'd locked him out of their house while depending on his money to keep it. He listened to his father's increasingly desperate explanations with a calmness that surprised him. When Robert finally asked what had happened, why the payment hadn't gone through, Ethan's response was simple and devastating. He told him about the locks, about the text message, about being declared untrustworthy while funding their lives. Robert's silence stretched across the phone line like a chasm. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, become smaller somehow. He claimed he hadn't known about the locks, that Patricia and Bethany had made that decision without consulting him. But Ethan knew his father better than that. Robert had always been the type to let the women in his family make the emotional decisions while he stayed safely in the background, avoiding conflict. Now that same avoidance had cost them $5,600 a month they couldn't afford to lose. Ethan found himself explaining the situation with mechanical precision, how he'd been struggling to make ends meet, how he'd been planning to save for his own house but couldn't because of their mortgage, how he'd sacrificed his own financial future for a family that didn't trust him enough to give him a key. His father's breathing grew heavier with each revelation. Finally, Robert asked the question Ethan had been waiting for. What would it take to fix this? The answer came to Ethan with startling clarity. It wasn't about the money anymore, though the financial relief was significant. It was about respect, about being treated like a contributing family member instead of a convenient ATM with anger management issues. He told his father exactly what he wanted: a family meeting where everyone acknowledged what he'd been sacrificing, an apology for the lock situation, and a formal agreement about expectations. If they wanted his financial help to continue, Robert agreed immediately, too quickly, the way desperate people do when they're drowning. But Ethan wasn't finished. He also wanted Bethany to contribute financially to the household if she was going to live there rent-free. She had a job at a local marketing firm, made decent money, but had been coasting on the family's protection while he bled money for their security. The conversation ended with Robert promising to arrange everything, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame or might have been just fear of losing the house. 3 days passed before Ethan heard from anyone else in his family. 3 days during which he imagined increasingly frantic conversations in the Southeast Portland house he'd been helping to pay for. He used the time productively, finally unpacking his remaining boxes, arranging his apartment like someone who planned to stay. He bought plants, hung pictures, ordered a new couch to replace the hand-me-down furniture he'd been making do with. For the first time in months, he cooked real meals instead of surviving on takeout and protein bars. The difference in his stress levels was remarkable. He'd been carrying the weight of their financial problems for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to only worry about his own bills. When Bethany finally called, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. She started with accusations. How could he abandon the family? How selfish could he be? How Dad's health couldn't handle this kind of stress. Ethan listened with the phone held slightly away from his ear, her familiar manipulation tactics washing over him like background noise. Bethany's tone shifted when she realized her guilt tactics weren't working. Suddenly, she was the reasonable one, trying to find a compromise, suggesting they could all sit down and work things out like adults. The transformation was so swift it was almost comical. This was the same woman who'd supported changing the locks on him, who'd been living rent-free in the house he was paying for while positioning herself as the more responsible child. Now she needed him, and her entire approach changed accordingly. Ethan found himself oddly detached from her emotional manipulations, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. When she finally asked what he wanted, he repeated the same conditions he'd given Robert: full family acknowledgement of his financial contributions, an apology for the lock situation, and her agreement to contribute to household expenses. Bethany's response was immediate and predictable. She couldn't afford to pay rent. She was still recovering from her divorce. She needed time to get back on her feet. The same excuses she'd been using for over a year. The family meeting happened at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Portland that Patricia suggested, probably thinking the public setting would keep emotions in check. Ethan arrived first, ordered a large coffee, and claimed a corner table where he could see the entrance. He felt strangely calm, almost detached, as he watched his family walk in together. They looked like they'd been arguing in the car. Patricia's lips were pressed into a thin line. Robert's shoulders were hunched with stress, and Bethany wore the martyred expression she'd perfected over the years. They ordered their drinks with stilted politeness before joining him at the table. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Patricia cleared her throat and began what was obviously a prepared speech about family loyalty and misunderstandings. Ethan listened without interrupting, noting how she managed to apologize for the lock situation, while simultaneously justifying it as a reasonable precaution after recent tensions. Her ability to apologize without actually taking responsibility was impressive in its audacity. When Patricia finished her non-apology, Robert jumped in with financial details that revealed just how precarious their situation had become. Without Ethan's monthly payment, they had exactly 2 months before foreclosure proceedings would begin. His father's health insurance didn't cover everything, and they'd been using the house's equity to cover medical bills. The revelation hit Ethan harder than he'd expected. They weren't just taking advantage of his generosity. They were genuinely desperate. But desperation didn't excuse treating him like a threat to be locked out of the family home. When it was Bethany's turn to speak, she surprised him by actually apologizing, her voice small and defensive. She admitted the lock idea had been hers, that she'd been feeling territorial about the house since moving back, that she'd convinced their mother Ethan was becoming too demanding about family decisions. The honesty was unexpected and more effective than any of Patricia's manipulative explanations. For the first time since this whole situation started, Ethan felt his anger begin to soften into something more complex. But Ethan had learned too much about himself in the past week to simply fold under family pressure. The relief of not making that crushing monthly payment had shown him how much he'd been sacrificing without acknowledgement or appreciation. He laid out his terms clearly. He would resume the mortgage payments, but under a formal agreement that outlined everyone's responsibilities. Bethany would contribute $300 monthly toward household expenses, a token amount that wouldn't strain her budget but would establish the principle that living in the house came with obligations. Patricia and Robert would add his name to the house deed as partial owner, recognizing his financial investment. And most importantly, they would treat him as an equal adult family member, which meant no more unilateral decisions about locks or anything else affecting him. The terms were reasonable, more generous than what most people would offer after such treatment. But the look that passed between his parents and sister told him everything he needed to know about their reluctance to share any actual control. Patricia's response was swift and predictable. They couldn't possibly add him to the deed because of complicated legal and tax implications she couldn't quite explain. Robert nodded along nervously, clearly out of his depth but supporting his wife's position. Bethany was more direct in her objection to paying monthly contributions, arguing that she provided emotional support and household help that was worth more than money. Ethan listened to their objections with growing clarity about his family's true priorities. They wanted his money, but not his influence. They wanted his financial sacrifice, but not his equal participation in family decisions. The coffee shop conversation continued for another hour, but the essential dynamic became clear within the first 10 minutes of their resistance. They would take what they could get from him while giving back as little as possible. When he finally stood to leave, Patricia grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking into something closer to panic. The mask was slipping, and underneath was simply fear of losing their comfortable arrangement. That evening, Ethan sat in his apartment with a legal pad, writing out the financial reality of his decision. Without the mortgage payment, he could save nearly $4,000 monthly after covering his increased rent and living expenses. In 1 year, he'd have enough for a solid down payment on his own place. In 2 years, he could buy something significantly better than what he could afford now. The math was compelling, but the emotional calculation was more complex. He thought about family loyalty, about his father's health, about the house where he'd grown up. But he also thought about respect, about being valued for more than his bank account, about building a life where his generosity was appreciated rather than expected. His phone had been buzzing intermittently, with text messages from various family members, each trying a different approach to bring him back into line. Patricia sent guilt. Robert sent desperation. Bethany sent anger followed by fake sweetness. None of them sent understanding or genuine acknowledgement of what he'd been providing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert called 3 days later, alone this time, his voice different than it had been in the coffee shop. He'd been thinking about their conversation, he said, really thinking about what Ethan had been doing for the family. The numbers were stark when laid out clearly. $57,600 over 2 years, money that had kept them in their home while Ethan lived in a cramped apartment and postponed his own dreams. Robert's voice cracked as he admitted he'd failed as a father by not protecting Ethan from Patricia and Bethany's manipulations, by not ensuring his son's sacrifices were recognized and respected. This wasn't the desperate financial negotiation from before, but something closer to genuine remorse. When Robert offered to personally guarantee that Ethan would be added to the deed and that Bethany would contribute monthly, his voice carried a weight of authority that had been missing from their previous conversations. For the first time since this crisis began, Ethan heard his father acting like a father rather than a negotiator. The formal family meeting happened the following Sunday, this time at the house Ethan had been paying for but couldn't enter. Robert had insisted on having keys made for Ethan before the meeting, a symbolic gesture that felt more significant than it probably should have. Walking through the front door he'd been locked out of felt strange, like returning to a place that was simultaneously familiar and foreign. The house looked the same, but his perspective had fundamentally changed. He was no longer the prodigal son returning home, but a financial partner examining his investment. Patricia and Bethany were stiffly polite, clearly coached by Robert about the new dynamic. The legal documents were already prepared, deed modification papers, and a family financial agreement that outlined everyone's responsibilities and rights. Signing his name to the deed felt like claiming space he'd earned through sacrifice. When Bethany handed him her first monthly contribution check, her expression was resentful but resigned. The money wasn't the point anymore. The acknowledgement was everything. 6 months later, Ethan stood in the kitchen of the Southeast Portland house, making coffee with the expensive grinder he'd brought from his apartment. The arrangement was working better than anyone had expected. Bethany had actually started contributing more than the minimum monthly amount, apparently motivated by having skin in the game. Patricia treated him with a new level of respect that came from recognizing his financial partnership in their security. Most importantly, Robert had stepped back into his role as family leader, making sure decisions were discussed rather than dictated. Ethan had kept his apartment as well, splitting time between his own space and the family home according to his preferences rather than their expectations. The dynamic had shifted from him being the family's financial resource to being a respected family member who happened to provide financial support. His phone buzzed with a text from his mortgage company, confirming the monthly payment had processed successfully. This time, the payment felt like a choice rather than an obligation, an investment in a family relationship that had been rebuilt on mutual respect rather than desperate need.